Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and we'll be looking at another discourse of the Buddha from the Anguttara Nikaya. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the discourse and give some explanation, and I'll take any questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So I see a few people checking in online. Hello to Louisa, Sean, Gita, Mano, Lee, Mary, and whoever else is watching. So this evening we'll be looking at the Anusotasutta, just from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 4, sutta number 5. And Anusota is translated here, I'm looking at Bhante Suddhāso's translation. It's translated here as with the stream. So the prefix anu means following or with or according to. And the word sota means stream, the same word from which we get sotapanna, stream enterer. So the Buddha here is beginning the sutta. He says, "These four people are found in the world." What for? A person who goes with the stream, a person who goes against the stream, a steadfast person, and a Brahmin who has passed over and stands on the far shore. So this is the basic framework that the Buddha is using. So again, it's Anguttara Nikaya chapter 4, which means that it involves a list of 4 things. So in this case, the Buddha is speaking about 4 different kinds of people. So the first one is the Anusotagami Pugala. So Pugala is a person who is going, Gami, in accordance, Anu, with the stream, Sota. So someone who's following the stream. And the Buddha will explain in a minute what he means by these, but briefly, someone who's going along with the stream is a metaphor which we see in many places in the suttas as meaning just like the ordinary person who's just going with the flow of an ordinary life, following the ordinary dictates of society and culture and following their instincts and impulses and desires, and basically just an ordinary person going with the flow, going with the herd would be another way you could put this. Like just another sheep going with the herd. So in the suttas, the Buddha commonly makes a distinction between the person who's going with the stream in the sense of they're just following along with all the ordinary person stuff that people do, getting a job, making money, buying random crap, getting married or not getting married as the case may be these days, having kids and dying unsatisfied and being reborn somewhere unpleasant, and then repeating the cycle a few 100 million times. So ordinary person going with the stream, going with the flow of ordinary life. And the opposite is the Patisota Gami Pugala. So Pati means against or opposite to. So someone who's going against the stream, against the current. So the current of the world is constantly pushing us to follow our desires, to do what everybody else is doing, to value what our society and culture values, which these days is incredibly shallow and materialistic. So modern culture, especially in the Western world, but it's also becoming increasingly prevalent in the rest of the world as well. But modern culture is increasingly superficial and materialistic. So following the stream of modern society means following that stream of materialistic and superficial thought, emotion, and behavior. And values. So going against the stream then means somebody who is deliberately trying to go against their impulses, their urges, their instincts, and against the dictates of society, trying to go against the conditioning of society. So this is something which takes a tremendous amount of courage and dedication. It's much easier just to go with the flow. So the simile the Buddha is using here is quite relevant for anyone who's ever tried swimming in a river. If you swim with the current, it's very easy. You can go very far. You can get very fast. But if you try to swim against the current, it's very difficult. You can get exhausted very quickly. It feels like a struggle. It's really hard to get anywhere. It takes a really long time to go even short distances. So, of course, the natural thing is just to go with the flow. Go with the flow of society. It's like, well, everybody else is getting ordinary jobs and having ordinary relationships and living ordinary lives and dying ordinary deaths and being reborn over and over and over again. It's all perfectly ordinary. So that's the easy route, and that's what we've already been doing for countless lifetimes. Going against the stream is much more difficult. Going against the current of our instincts and impulses, against the current of societal conditioning, this is much more difficult, but it's the only way to attain awakening. If one could attain awakening by going with the current of the world, then everybody would be enlightened by now. It's only by deliberately going against the current of the world. But even then, it has to be done in a particular way, as the Buddha explains all throughout the suttas. So the third kind of person he mentions is translated here simply as steadfast, but I think that's kind of missing the imagery that the Buddha is using here. So the Pali word is tittatta. So titta literally means standing. Someone who's standing still. So someone who, steadfast is okay, but it has the sense of someone who is immovable, someone who's completely stable, someone who, so coming back to the imagery of the river, so we have like the current is pushing you, but when you're completely stable, so you're standing completely steady and still in the river, then you're aware of the current, but it doesn't push you. It doesn't have any effect on you. So that's the imagery he's using here. So this third person is somebody who, although they're aware of the currents of the world, they're not affected by them at all. As opposed to the person who's swimming against the current, they're constantly struggling and fighting with the current of the river. And then the fourth person is translated here as a Brahmin who has crossed over and stands on the far shore. So the term crossed over is a synonym for awakened, as is one who's gone to the far shore. So parangata means one who's gone to the opposite side. So that's, again, used to mean someone who's fully awakened. They've reached full awakening. And standing on the shore, so tale tittati, again, has the sense of standing on the opposite shore, like one is established in nibbana, established in enlightenment. So this last line here is talking about the arhat, someone who's fully awakened. So then the Buddha clarifies what he means by this. So first he says, who is the person who goes with the stream? He says, it's a person who takes part in sensual pleasures and who does bad deeds. This is called the person who goes with the stream. So kame patisevati, so one engages in sensuality. One is dedicated and devoted to sensuality, which, again, it's so incredibly pervasive in this world that it's not considered blameworthy. In fact, it's considered normal. Actually, these days, often if somebody is not interested in sensuality, that it's considered that something's wrong with them. Like, oh, you don't blindly follow your impulses and urges? How strange. They might even recommend that you go to a psychologist. They might think there's something wrong with you. So actively engaging in sensuality, being committed and dedicated to sensuality is part of what it means to be normal, to be ordinary. And, as the Buddha says, it is completely unbeneficial. It does not lead to awakening. It doesn't lead to any long-term benefit. And further, he says the person who goes with the stream does evil deeds. Papancha kamang karoti. They make bad karma. Again, this is not necessarily directly connected with the previous statement. So in engaging in sensuality, There's degrees of karma involved. So just the ordinary sensuality of having a nice meal or watching the sunset is relatively harmless. On the other end, we have people who enjoy torturing sentient beings. That's far, far worse karma, much worse karma. But again, someone who's just going with the stream, again, if you're just following the dictates of society, doing what everybody else is doing, following along with your impulses and urges, then all of that might be encouraging you to make bad choices. It might be encouraging you to kill, to steal. It might be encouraging you to engage in sexual misconduct. It might be encouraging you to tell lies, to use alcohol. These are all things which are considered perfectly acceptable under particular circumstances. They're all considered perfectly acceptable by society. So killing, well, if you're given permission to by the government, it's considered fine. You want to join the military and go kill people? Well, okay. Of course, according to the Buddha's teachings, we know that's evil, bad karma. But the dictates of society are that under certain circumstances, killing is not only acceptable, it's actually praiseworthy. It's actually good. Or stealing. Again, it depends upon the circumstances. There are circumstances where taking other people's things is actually considered the right course of action. As, for example, if you've ever had your property repossessed by the government. It's like, well, it was yours, and now somebody came and stole it from you, but that's considered acceptable. It's not considered problematic. So, of course, things like telling lies or using alcohol, these are all things which we often actually get a lot of pressure from society, a lot of pressure telling us that these things are good and appropriate under the right circumstances. So, again, if one's just going with the stream, just following the flow of society, following the flow of ordinary life, following the flow of your ordinary human impulses, well, all of that is going to mean that you're likely to make a tremendous amount of bad karma. So one needs to really watch that thing of like, oh, I just want to be an ordinary person living an ordinary life like everybody else. No, you really don't, because that's just going to stockpile a tremendous amount of bad karma. So then the second one, the Buddha says, who is the person who goes against the stream? He says, it's a person who does not engage in sensuality and does not do evil karma, does not do bad deeds. And he says, they live the full and pure spiritual life, even though they're experiencing pain and depression, weeping with tearful faces. So this line here about living the full and pure spiritual life, even though one does so with pain and depression, weeping with tearful face. This line appears in a few places in the suttas, and usually it's referring to monastics. So there's other places where I've seen this line where it actually specifically says a bhikkhu or bhikkhuni who's practicing with difficulty, and it uses this line. So with dukkha and domanassa, so with pain and depression, weeping with tearful face, it's the same line. So the point the Buddha is making here is that when we recognize the danger of going with the current of desire, the current of aversion, the current of societal and cultural conditioning, of social pressure, social norms, when we see the danger of going with that current, then we start swimming against it. We start deliberately going against this constant pressure to indulge ourselves in sensuality, this constant pressure to do what others expect of you, this constant pressure to set aside moral principles and just do whatever is considered culturally acceptable. So we start going against that. And especially in the beginning, this process is quite uncomfortable. So we're used to getting pleasure through sensuality. So when we set aside sensuality, often we don't know how to be happy anymore. We think, oh, before I attained happiness through sensuality, but now I'm not doing that. So where's my happiness coming from? So it can seem quite challenging. One also can easily become estranged from one's peers, one's friends and family who maybe don't see the world the way we do. They maybe don't think there's anything wrong with indulgence. They don't think there's anything wrong with breaking precepts. They might not even have a concept of precepts. In fact, they might even think that the best thing to do is to go with the stream of society. So when one starts actively going against the stream and cultivating a spiritual life, one will often experience pressure from one's friends and family, pressure from one's peers. One will often experience pressure to drop these practices and just conform to normality again. One might even experience harsh condemnation or judgment for being a weirdo. And it takes a certain amount of courage, a certain amount of courage just to say, no, this is what I'm doing. I know it's weird. I know it's unusual, extremely uncommon, in fact. And yet, I'm compelled to do that which is morally right. I'm compelled to do that which is spiritually wise. So it takes a certain amount of courage to do that. But it can be very uncomfortable. As one commits thoroughly to a spiritual practice, it's quite common that one's circle of friends shrinks dramatically. It turns out that most people in the world are not really interested in sincere spiritual practice. Even the people who are interested in spiritual practice are usually only interested in using it as a little bit of seasoning on their ordinary superficial life. It's like, oh yeah, I go to the movies, I go to the bar, I go to the club, and I also meditate on the weekends. It's like, well, okay. That's all right, I guess. But when somebody wants to commit to a 100% wholehearted spiritual life, well, even somewhat spiritual, ordinary people will see this as too far, too much, too extreme. It's like, can't you just live an ordinary life and do a little bit of spiritual practice? Why do you have to live this extremist life, this far out life where you don't drink? How weird. You don't tell white lies. How weird. So when one starts to get that sense of rejection from one's peers, that sense of rejection from society as a whole, in fact, when one starts to sense that one is losing access to one's sources of happiness and pleasure, then all of that can in fact be quite depressing, quite uncomfortable. But the Buddha's encouragement that we see throughout the suttas, the Buddha's encouragement is to just keep pressing on, keep cultivating our practice, keep looking for sources of joy and happiness connected with the Dhamma, looking for ways to brighten and gladden and inspire the mind using wholesome themes, through cultivation of things that are morally good and spiritually wise. And if we persist, then one does eventually get past this kind of uncomfortable, awkward period in the practice. So then the third one, the Buddha says, who is the steadfast person? So again, the one who's standing upright or standing still, the one who's established. And he says, it's the person who, with the ending of the 5 lower fetters, is reborn spontaneously. They attain enlightenment there, and are not prone to returning from that world. So in this case, he's translating the person who is stable as being somebody who has attained the 3rd stage of awakening, which is the stage of non-return. And in the context of this sutta, it actually makes sense that he says that, because the critical characteristic of the non-returner is that they have completely, permanently removed desire and aversion from their mind. So when desire is completely removed from the mind, then one no longer has any impulse to engage in sensuality, at least not for its own sake. One will still do things like eat in order to nourish the body and so on, but one will not indulge in any sensual activity purely for the sake of pleasure. And also one no longer has aversion. So one also isn't bothered or disturbed by things. One isn't bothered by societal rejection, for example. One isn't bothered by the poor opinion of others who are living in a less spiritual life. These aren't things which affect the mind of a non-returner. They're so well established in the Dhamma that they're not being battered around by desire and aversion. So they're not being affected by all the things that we're making the spiritual life difficult at the beginning. So again, this is like somebody who they're standing in the river, but they're not affected by the current. It doesn't knock them over. It doesn't disturb them. It doesn't throw off their balance. They're perfectly fine. So in the same way, as we become increasingly established in the Dhamma, as we apply the tools the Buddha gave us to reduce our desire and aversion, then we become less and less affected by the stream of the world. We become less and less affected by the harmful currents of society, and also by the harmful currents of our own impulses. So these inner urges become weaker and weaker as we continue our practice. And therefore, they have less and less ability to disturb our mind. And then the fourth one, he says, who is a Brahmin that has crossed over and stands on the far shore? And he says, it's a person who realizes the undefiled freedom of heart and freedom by wisdom in this very life. So again, this is one of the ways that the Buddha defines an arhat, a fully awakened person. And he says, and they live having realized it with their own insight due to the ending of defilements. This is called a Brahmin who has crossed over and stands on the far shore. So again, this is the standard definition of an arhat, somebody who has completely gone beyond the flows of samsara, the flows of the ordinary world. They're no longer affected by any of the things which can generate dukkha in the mind. They're no longer touched by dukkha in any way. They're completely free from suffering in all its forms, and completely free from delusion in all its forms. So then, as is common in the Anguttara Nikaya, this sutta ends with a short poem, just reiterating the point of the sutta. So I'll read quickly through the poem, as it doesn't really add much to the sutta in terms of information content. It's more just like a reiteration. So it says, all those people with unbridled sensuality, not free of lust, enjoying sensuality in this life, again and again they return to birth and old age. Those who go with the stream are sunk in craving. So the attentive in this life, with mindfulness established, do not engage in sensuality or in bad deeds. Even though they have painfully given up sensuality, such a person is called one who goes against the stream. Someone who has given up 5 corruptions, a perfect trainee who is not liable to decline, who has mastered their mind with faculties in samadhi, is called a steadfast person. And finally it says, the sage who has comprehended all things, high and low, cleared them and ended them so they are no more. They've completed the spiritual journey and gone to the end of the world. They are called one who has gone beyond. So that's the end of the sutta. We can respect it with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So at this time, we'll see if there's any questions. So hello to the other people who have checked in. Hello to Yankee, Wasabi-chan, Ryushin, Jayanta, Maria, Julie, Sud, Maitreyi, Sister Sunny, and everybody else who's joining in. And I see a question here from Sud, who says, why do we, even though we have a tendency towards practice of Dhamma, still have a pull towards sensuality, even though we know it's not beneficial to spiritual life? So I like to think of it that every one of us has multiple minds that exist in parallel. So kind of like compartmentalized minds. So it's actually quite normal. So you have one compartment of your mind, which is all like, yes, Dhamma practice is the way. I'm all about Dhamma practice. I want to live a spiritual life. And then you have another compartment of your mind, which is like, I just want to have all the good stuff and all the pleasant stuff, and I want it right now. And I've got a list of all the really pleasant things that I want as soon as possible and as much as possible. Then you have another compartment of your mind, which is like, I hate everything, especially you and him and her and those people over there. And these sensations and these experiences, I hate all of it and I want to avoid it. And there's another part of your mind which is like, I just want to space out and fantasize and daydream and hang out in la la land as much as possible. So our mind tends to be kind of compartmentalized into these distinct sections, which each have their own values, their own tendencies, their own momentum. And so as we're engaging in spiritual practice, what we're effectively doing is that we're trying to nurture and build up the spiritual sector of the mind while diminishing the other sectors of the mind. And this process takes a long time, years, decades, centuries, lifetimes. So it takes a very long time. And in the beginning, what's usually going to be happening is that we'll be in our spiritual mode for a little while, maybe a few minutes, and then we'll just slip back into one of our other modes, one of our habitual ways of thinking and feeling and relating. And that will usually be based on non-spiritual principles, non-spiritual values. And then eventually we realize what we're doing and we gently bring ourselves back to the spiritual side of our mind, and we practice for a while, and then we slip back into those old modes. So it's like very strong habits. We build these very strong habits of relating to the world in a defiled way, a corrupt way. And we've been building up those habits for innumerable lifetimes. So then building up the spiritual side of the mind, it's actually quite normal that we're going to be constantly slipping back into our old habitual ways of thinking and feeling and relating. So whenever you notice you're slipping back, well, you just gently guide the mind back to the spiritual compartment, back to the spiritual mode. And it takes a long time to retrain and restructure the mind in this way. Okay, and Maitreyi has a question here, but it's not at all related to the sutta. So Maitreyi, that's a good question. You can bring it to Monk Chat on Friday evening. That's the chance to ask any questions. But during the sutta study, we just ask questions about the sutta itself. And Stevie has a question. When can we experience joy without falling trapped to sensual pleasure? What is acceptable to experience joy from? Well, in the suttas, there's a few examples. So one of the more accessible examples is called joy connected with the Dhamma. And in the suttas, this is defined as when somebody is listening to the Dhamma, which could mean listening to a Dhamma talk, as is going on right now, or it could mean reading a Dhamma book or reading the suttas, which is what I recommend, is reading the suttas. And while you're hearing the Dhamma, you have some understanding of it. You get some appreciation of the beauty and depth and power of the Dhamma. And with that appreciation of the beauty and power and depth of the Dhamma, there arises joy connected with the Dhamma. And I'm just thinking about it now, my mind is getting joyful. So this is one way of accessing it. So you study some Dhamma, you learn some Dhamma, and you reflect on the Dhamma, and you reflect on the beauty and profundity and potency of the Dhamma. Building up a sense of awe and reverence and delight in the exquisite perfection of the Dhamma, the delightful beauty of the Dhamma, the power of the Dhamma. And as you do that, the mind becomes increasingly joyful, and you can build up that joy connected with the Dhamma. That's one. Another one is the Buddha recommends to recollect one's own goodness. So recollecting one's kindness, one's generosity, recollecting one's compassion, recollecting one's self-restraint, recollecting any good qualities that one has, and delighting in those good qualities, delighting in any wholesomeness or any goodness or any praiseworthy spiritual qualities one has cultivated. That also tends to bring a lot of joy to the mind. And of course, the Buddha also spoke in many places about the value, in particular, of samadhi. So through meditation practice, we can train the mind to become very stable and very still. And in that stable, alert stillness, joy arises. The mind starts to delight in stillness and clarity. And that can be accelerated. So when you're doing meditation, as the mind starts to become a little bit more peaceful and clear, then appreciate that stillness, appreciate that peacefulness, appreciate that clarity, even if it's just for a few seconds. Building up that appreciation of the peacefulness and stillness and clarity of the mind. And as you do so, then the mind will tend to become more stable, more still, more clear, which then makes it even easier to cultivate the joy connected with samadhi, which then contributes to the samadhi, which then contributes to the joy. And this will then create a lovely feedback loop that leads right into jhana. So that leads right into this incredibly profound, stable stillness of mind, where one can cultivate wisdom. But the Buddha actually directly says that the path to overcoming sensuality is to experience the pleasure of jhana, the pleasure of samadhi, the pleasure of strong, stable, clear stillness during meditation. So those are a few examples. Okay, and Q Vibe says, how can I maintain inner peace and respond skillfully when my parents keep pressuring me to marry and have children? They say if I don't have children, I will regret it in the future. I think it's the opposite, actually. If you have children, you will regret it in the future. So Q Vibe continues, it's not that I refuse marriage or children, but I wish to find someone who truly understands me and with whom I can engage in deep intellectual and spiritual conversations. Am I expecting too much? They carry on, but to become a stream enterer, one cannot get married or have children. So let's go through this. So first off, odds are that your parents just want you to be happy, but odds are that your parents are delusional, because generally speaking, most people are not enlightened, which means they are by default delusional. And especially the kind of people who get married and have children are almost always delusional. So your parents are giving you advice from a place of delusion. However, their intentions are probably good. They probably actually really believe that the path to happiness is to have children, get married and have children. However, you can actually ask yourself, how many people do I know who have gotten married and had children? Probably you know a fair few. How many of them are 100% perfectly happy all the time, no matter what? Probably somewhere around 0. You can also think, maybe you know a lot of people who haven't gotten married and had children, and you can think, is it really any different for them? Are they really living an absolutely awful, horrible life just because they're not married and don't have children? Probably not. In fact, you'll probably realize that happiness doesn't really have much correlation to marriage and children. That's been my experience anyway. I actually haven't seen any connection whatsoever between the two. That's not true. I think there's a significantly higher suffering rate with people who get married and have children. Significantly higher. I actually don't think it's a way to happiness. I actually think it's quite the opposite. It actually makes your life substantially worse. But even setting aside my personal experience, I'm willing to bet you'll find that there's not a substantial correlation, that getting married and having children probably does not mean you are guaranteed happiness for the rest of your life. And it definitely does not guarantee spiritual progress. Otherwise, the Buddha would have recommended it. But we don't see anywhere in the suttas, nowhere in the suttas, does the Buddha recommend getting married and having children. Nowhere. But in many cases, he recommends renunciation, letting go of sensuality, letting go of sexuality, letting go of family ties, which includes children, letting go of all worldly attachments and engagements. This is what the Buddha says leads to true happiness. So, again, appreciate the fact that your parents are trying to help you, but also recognize that their advice may not be relevant to you. As is often the case. And as for you saying that You want to find someone who truly understands you and with whom you can engage in deep intellectual and spiritual conversations. Are you expecting too much? I mean, if you're going to spend your life with someone, it's much better to spend your life with a good spiritual practitioner. The Buddha said as much. The Buddha said that if you're going to have a companion, then ideally your companion should be a wise spiritual person, someone who supports you in your spiritual practice and does not drag you down from your path. So this is very relevant in monastic life, where we really do make an effort to try to associate and be with people who are genuinely committed to spiritual practice and who will support us in our practice. So if you are going to commit your life to someone, then yeah, somebody who supports your practice is ideal. And actually, the Buddha said if you can't find such a person, it's better to be alone. It's better to be alone than to be with a fool. This is what the Buddha said. So yeah, actually, I think take your time. Don't rush into a relationship just because your parents want you to. But really, like, wait until you find somebody who actually is a good spiritual support for you, someone who's actually going to help you on your path. Or just be single. That's also perfectly fine. And Q-Vibe says, to become a stream mentor, one cannot get married or have children. Actually, there's numerous examples in the suttas of lay people who were not celibate and who were stream mentorers. One of my favorite examples is the courtesan Ambapali, who was a highly popular courtesan who had many relationships and many children and became a stream mentorer. And clearly that wasn't an obstacle for her. And in fact, the Buddha never said anything against it or about it. So I find that interesting as a clear example. But to get beyond stream entry, absolutely yes, you have to drop sensuality. This is what defines the once-returner and the non-returner, is that they erode and eventually completely eliminate sensual desire. So that is incompatible with a sexual life. Just doesn't work. So without sensual desire, then it's impossible to live a sexual life. So a once-returner will have very little interest in sexuality, and a non-returner will have zero. Absolutely zero. So if one is committed to progressing beyond stream entry, then yes, celibacy is highly recommended, effectively necessary. As for having children, again, if you have children, then that will consume at least the next 20 years of your life, which will leave you very little time for anything else. So ask yourself if that's really what you want to be doing. Q-Vibe says, I see many families with marriage and children who seem to appear to be very happy though. Yeah, and I see lots of people who are not married and don't have children who seem to be pretty happy. So once again, you'll find happy people and miserable people everywhere in the world doing everything imaginable. So I have not personally observed any correlation here. Have I seen people who are married with children who are happy? Yes, a few. Have I seen ones who are miserable? Yes, lots. Have I seen people who are not married and did not have children who are happy? Yeah, plenty. I'm one of them, in fact. In fact, I spend a lot of time with people who are like that. So clearly, getting married and having children is not a requirement for happiness. And Mary's mentioning the fire. Yes, so there was one of the Buddhist temples in New York City, close by here, caught fire last night, and 2 people died, including one of the monks. So anybody who wants to help, you can look online, WAT USA, WAT space USA. You can see how to support. And Q-Vibe says, how can I tell whether my current human life is one of the last 7 human rebirths of Stream Mentor? This is getting a little off topic. So great question, but Q-Vibe, you can bring that to Monk Chat on Friday evening. And that looks like the last question from online. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.